The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 4B in the Cook County Juvenile Justice Center hummed with an electrical indifference that matched the cold stares penetrating 17-year-old Marcus Anthony Carter's back as he stood before the bench, his hands trembling despite his attempt to appear stoic and unaffected by the weight of judgment pressing down on his narrow shoulders like an invisible force determined to crush whatever remained of his dignity and hope for a future beyond the South Side. Streets that had raised him in their unforgiving embrace. Judge Patricia Hendricks peered down from her elevated position, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, her expression carved from granite, and years of seeing young black boys cycle through her courtroom with such predictable regularity that she had apparently decided their fates were predetermined by circumstances beyond anyone's control, certainly beyond her own willingness to extend mercy or recognize the complex humanity standing before her in an ill-fitting suit, borrowed from the funeral home where his cousin worked part-time between shifts at the McDonald's on 63rd Street. Marcus could hear his mother's quiet sobbing from the gallery behind him, each choked breath a knife twisting in his chest because he knew that LaShonda Carter had taken off work from her overnight shift at Rush University Medical Center, sacrificing precious hours of sleep and the wages she desperately needed to keep their small two-bedroom apartment in the Englewood neighborhood where rent was cheap but safety was expensive and purchased with constant vigilance and prayer to the Baptist God. She served faithfully every Sunday at Greater Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church on Ashland Avenue. The charges read like a script Marcus had heard recited for too many of his friends and neighbors over the years, a tragic liturgy of the streets that began with possession with intent to distribute narcotics, specifically 23 grams of crack cocaine found in a backpack that technically belonged to his cousin Darnell, but which Marcus had been holding for exactly 14 minutes when officers Patterson and Rodriguez conducted what they termed a routine stop for suspicious activity, though Marcus knew with certainty that suspicious activity translated simply to being young and black and walking through his own neighborhood on a Tuesday afternoon after his shift at the Jewel Osco grocery store, where he stocked shelves for $8.75 an hour in a futile attempt to help his mother cover the utility bills that seemed to multiply like the roaches in their building's hallways, despite the landlord's empty promises of extermination and basic maintenance. His public defender, an exhausted-looking woman named Jennifer Walsh, who carried a caseload of 63 juveniles and possessed neither the time nor the resources to mount anything resembling an adequate defense, had advised him to accept the plea bargain of 2 years probation with mandatory drug counseling and community service, explaining in a tone that suggested she had delivered this same speech hundreds of times before that fighting the charges would likely result in a harsher sentence and potential transfer to adult court, where the consequences multiplied exponentially for young men who looked like Marcus and came from neighborhoods that polite society preferred to ignore, except when crime statistics needed to be cited as evidence of moral failing rather than systemic neglect. Marcus had wanted to scream that the drugs weren't his, that he had been helping his cousin carry groceries from the corner store, that the backpack had been thrust into his hands with a desperate whispered plea to hold it for just a minute, while Darnell ran back inside to grab the hot sauce their grandmother had forgotten, but the words died in his throat because he understood with the premature wisdom forced upon children who grow up in war zones disguised as American cities, that the truth held no currency in spaces where assumption and prejudice had already rendered their verdicts long before any evidence could be presented or context could be considered by those whose life experiences existed in such radically different universes that they might as well have been separate species, incapable of recognizing each other's basic humanity beneath the surface differences of skin tone and zip code, and access to opportunities that determined whether mistakes became learning experiences or Life sentences delivered by a system designed to confirm its own biases. Judge Hendricks shuffled the papers before her with the mechanical efficiency of someone processing widgets on an assembly line rather than determining the trajectory of a human life. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the sharp edge of contempt, wrapped in the false veneer of tough love that white America so often mistakes for wisdom. When addressing black youth, they have already condemned in their hearts, if not yet officially in their courtrooms. Mr. Carter, I've seen hundreds of young men just like you come through my courtroom over the past 15 years, Judge Hendricks began, her tone suggesting that being just like Marcus was itself an indictment rather than a neutral observation about the systemic forces that funneled young black men from underfunded schools to overcrowded prisons with assembly line precision. Every single one of them has stood where you're standing right now, making the same excuses, blaming everyone but themselves for the choices that brought them here. Your mother works hard. I can see that from her employment records. But hard work isn't enough to overcome poor decision-making and association with criminal elements. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as anger bubbled up from somewhere deep in his chest, mixing with shame and helplessness into a toxic cocktail that threatened to explode from his mouth in a torrent of words that would only prove her point and seal his fate more completely than any evidence or testimony could accomplish. His mother's pastor, Reverend Johnson from Greater Mount Zion, had counseled him before the hearing to remain silent, to show respect regardless of how disrespected he felt, to remember that God saw everything even when earthly judges remained blind to the full picture. But standing there, absorbing Judge Hendricks's words, felt like swallowing glass while being told it was for his own good and that he should be grateful for the opportunity to learn through pain. I'm going to accept the plea agreement your attorney has negotiated, Judge Hendricks continued, removing her glasses to look directly at Marcus with eyes that seemed to catalogue and dismiss him simultaneously. 2 years probation, mandatory drug counseling, 200 hours of community service. But let me be very clear with you, young man, because I want you to understand something important. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a register that somehow carried even more weight than her previous pronouncements, and Marcus felt his entire body tense in anticipation of whatever blow was coming next. This is your one chance, your only chance to turn your life around. You're going to violate this probation within 6 months. I can almost guarantee it based on the statistics and patterns I've observed over my career on this bench. When you do, and you will, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that I gave you an opportunity that, frankly, you probably don't deserve, given the evidence and circumstances of your case. You'll end up in jail again, probably Stateville or Menard. And you'll spend your 20s and 30s becoming exactly what everyone expects you to become. Another statistic, another cautionary tale, another young black man who had potential but threw it away because the streets were easier than the hard work of becoming something better. The courtroom fell silent, except for the sound of Marcus's mother openly weeping now, her grief and rage and helplessness manifesting in sobs that echoed off the institutional beige walls, decorated with portraits of stern-looking white men who had probably never set foot in neighborhoods like Englewood, except perhaps to drive through with their doors locked and their windows up. Their brief glimpses of poverty and struggle filtered through glass and distance, and the comfortable assumption that what they witnessed was the result of individual moral failure, rather than centuries of deliberate policy decisions designed to concentrate disadvantage and then punish those trapped within its boundaries for the predictable outcomes of such concentration. Marcus wanted to turn around and comfort his mother, to tell her that everything would be okay, even though he had no evidence to support such a claim and every reason to believe that Judge Hendricks had just spoken a curse over his life that would fulfill itself through the sheer power of expectation. and the grinding machinery of a criminal justice system that excelled at creating recidivism while pretending to pursue rehabilitation. His younger sister Keisha, only 13 years old, but already showing signs of the sharp intelligence and determination that Marcus prayed would carry her somewhere far beyond the South Side's gravitational pull, sat beside their mother, with tears streaming down her face, and Marcus felt something crack inside his chest at the sight of her disappointment and fear, because he had promised her just that morning, over bowls of off-brand frosted flakes and powdered milk, that everything would work out fine, that the judge would understand, that justice existed even for people like them if they just told the truth and trusted the system. The bailiff, a thick-necked man whose nameplate read Officer Thompson, stepped forward to escort Marcus out of the courtroom after Judge Hendricks dismissed him with a wave of her hand that suggested she had already moved on mentally to the next case on her docket, the next young life to be processed and filed away in whatever category her experience and prejudices deemed appropriate. Marcus turned finally to look at his mother and sister, trying to communicate through his eyes everything he couldn't say aloud in this space where his words had no value and his truth found no purchase against the smooth surfaces of institutional indifference. LaShonda Carter looked smaller somehow than she had that morning, diminished by exhaustion and disappointment, but still managing to mouth the words, "I love you," as her son was led toward the side door that separated the judged from their families, the condemned from those who would carry the weight of that condemnation in their hearts and homes long after the court proceedings concluded and the paperwork was filed away in cabinets that groaned under the weight of similar stories repeated with soul-crushing frequency across America's courtrooms, where justice was supposed to be blind but somehow always managed to see color with perfect clarity. Walking out of the Cook County Juvenile Justice Center into the gray November afternoon, with its premature darkness and wind that cut through his thin jacket like the judge's words had cut through his spirit, Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him, a kind of death and birth happening simultaneously as the boy he had been that morning confronted the reality of who the world had decided he was and would always be regardless of his own desires or efforts to the contrary. His mother and Keisha met him on the courthouse steps, where a small group of other families huddled against the cold, their faces reflecting various stages of grief and resignation as they absorbed whatever verdicts had been delivered to their own loved ones in the building's various courtrooms, where futures were determined by people who would never have to live with the consequences of their decisions, beyond the abstract satisfaction of believing they had upheld law and order in a society built on foundations of profound disorder disguised as natural hierarchy. The three of them stood there for a long moment, Marcus unable to meet his mother's eyes because he feared what he might see there. Blame or disappointment, or worst of all, the confirmation that Judge Hendricks had been right about him, that he was destined for the fate she had pronounced with such certainty, that his attempts to be something different or better were delusions doomed to shatter against the hard reality of a world that had already decided who he was allowed to be based on factors he had never chosen and could never change. "Baby, we're going to get through this," LaShonda finally said, her voice hoarse from crying, but carrying underneath the tears a steel core of determination that Marcus recognized as the same quality that had kept their small family afloat through his father's abandonment when Marcus was 8 and Keisha was 4, through layoffs and illnesses and the 1,000 small indignities of poverty in the richest country in human history. That judge don't know you, don't know your heart, don't know what God has planned for your life. She's just another person who can't see past her own prejudice to recognize that you're more than whatever she decided about you in there. They walked toward the bus stop on California Avenue, where the number 60 would eventually arrive to carry them back to Englewood, past the Harold's Chicken Shack, where Marcus used to buy his mother a 4-piece dinner on paydays when he could afford such small gestures of gratitude for her endless sacrifices, past the currency exchange where people cashed their paychecks because banks wouldn't open branches in neighborhoods they had redlined decades earlier and then blamed for the poverty that redlining had helped create and maintain through generations of systematic exclusion from wealth-building opportunities. Keisha walked beside her brother in unusual silence, her normally animated personality subdued by the weight of what she had witnessed in that courtroom, and Marcus made a silent promise to himself that whatever happened to him, whatever fulfillment Judge Hendrix's prophecy might eventually claim from his life, he would do everything in his power to ensure his sister escaped the gravity well of low expectations and limited options that had captured so many of their neighbors and friends and family members in its inescapable orbit. The bus ride home passed in a blur of gray buildings and gray faces, and the gray exhaustion that comes from fighting battles that seem already lost before they've properly begun. And when they finally climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, where the radiators clanked and hissed but never quite provided adequate heat during Chicago's brutal winters, Marcus went directly to the small room he shared with a hot plate and mini refrigerator, because the kitchen was really just an alcove off the living room, and he lay on his narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, while Judge Hendrix's words played on repeat in his mind like a curse or a prophecy, or perhaps both simultaneously. "You'll end up in jail again," she had said with such absolute certainty, and Marcus found himself caught between 2 equally powerful responses: the desire to prove her catastrophically wrong, and the creeping fear that she possessed some insight into his character or destiny that he himself couldn't see, but which others recognized immediately upon looking at his face or learning his address or reading the statistics about young black men from neighborhoods like Englewood, where the high school graduation rate hovered around 50%. And the incarceration rate climbed proportionally higher with each passing year, despite or perhaps because of policies claiming to address such disparities while actually deepening them through mechanisms too complex and deliberate to be dismissed as mere accident or unintended consequence. For the next few weeks, Marcus stumbled through his days as if moving underwater, every decision haunted by Judge Hendrix's voice and the echo of his mother's tearful prayers that rose every morning from their small South Side apartment. LaShonda's faith became both shield and spear. She led Keisha and Marcus in grace each night, her hands clasped so tightly Marcus could see the strain in her knuckles. "The Lord doesn't abandon his children," she'd whisper, referencing Psalm 34:18, her favorite scripture, even as her own eyes burned from exhaustion. Marcus's nights were even heavier. He lay awake, listening to the distant rattle of the red line and the shouts of young men hustling deals around the corner, the world outside layered in hustles and hunger, and the sharp aroma of fried chicken drifting up from Big Levi's diner across the street. These reminders of their neighborhood culture, Harold's Chicken Shack, corner stores selling sour pickles and lemon heads, and the Black Baptist Church at the end of the block, all marked his days, signposts of struggle that he couldn't outrun, no matter how many times he filled out job applications or volunteered at nearby Mercy Palms Community Center for his mandatory community service. The rules of probation followed him everywhere, like invisible chains. The paperwork he filled out at the Illinois Department of Juvenile Rehabilitation was dense and impersonal. Pages of questions about drugs, anger, home environment, answered one-handed while holding a cup of watery vending machine coffee. Marcus attended weekly group counseling led by Mrs. Loomis, a stoic social worker who, despite her best efforts, couldn't ever quite hide the fatigue creeping into her voice when another boy showed up stoned or missed 3 sessions because of a shooting on their block. Marcus listened, sometimes participated, but never confessed how every accusation of bad attitude felt like a referendum on his entire existence. At home, Keisha studied her textbooks from St. James School, while Marcus flipped through GED preparation guides in the dim light of their small living room. He'd dropped out 6 months before his arrest, convinced school was just another performance he couldn't master. But now he saw his sister striving and wondered if he could somehow change too. On Sundays, they put on their best clothes, pressed slacks for Marcus, a hand-me-down dress for Keisha, hat for LaShonda, and walked to Greater Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church. The sermons echoed across sturdy wooden pews, Pastor Johnson's voice rolling thunder through stained glass and dusty hymnals. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. At least once a month, Marcus counted. Nearly everyone inside was black, as were most in the 50 million Americans who call themselves evangelical Christians, according to Pew Research Center. In church, Marcus sometimes felt like hope was real, a tangible thing waiting for him if he could just reach past old failures and the poverty that knotted their lives tighter each year. That hope was thin, but it was something. Outside the sanctuary, reality pressed hard. Marcus needed work, but finding a job with a record and unfinished education was nearly impossible. He managed shifts at Fresh Taste Grocers, a local supermarket chain headquartered in Chicago Heights, mopping floors, bagging groceries, and scrubbing the sub-shop counters after midnight. His co-workers included old classmates and weary adults, all trapped in the grind. The manager called him son, even though his own father had disappeared years ago. The word made Marcus flinch each time he heard it. Despite the steady grind of work, there was never enough money. The refrigerator was always half empty, stocked mainly with milk, eggs, and the cheapest cereals. The tastes of struggle and survival every day brought temptations. "Just run a package for me, 5 minutes," Darnell would say, eyes darting with nervous energy as he waved a crumpled wad of bills. Marcus refused, remembering the judge's prophecy, but doubt hovered. What if Judge Hendricks wasn't just cruel, but right? What if he truly couldn't escape the shadow of his conviction? He saw boys from his block pulled into dealing, their faces growing older and rarer in the classrooms and youth center, each disappearing act a warning he pressed against his own skin. The cold truth was that sometimes courage meant surviving one more day without risking everything. But the future Judge Hendricks prophesied always seemed just a misstep away. Then, Marcus met Mr. Samuel Washington. He first saw the old man sweeping up in the lobby of Mercy Palms Community Center, his back bent but his gaze intense, sharper than anyone else's. The encounter was ordinary enough. Marcus dropped off cleaning supplies. Sam asked if he could lend a hand with the senior lunch for the day. After a morning of serving collard greens, cornbread, and sweet tea, the flavors of Marcus's grandmother's kitchen, Sam plopped down next to him at a battered metal table and asked straight out, "Son, what's your story?" Marcus hesitated, expecting judgment, but Sam just nodded. Samuel Washington's own hands bore decades of labor, every line forged in struggle. Turns out he'd been marching with Dr. King at age 16 and defending kids in Alabama's courts by his 30s. Now, at almost 80, he saw himself in every young face, bent under the weight of regret and inherited injustice. Sam watched Marcus with a simmering patience. "You want out, don't you?" he asked, voice gentle but firm. For the first time, Marcus admitted he didn't know how. Sam invited Marcus to weekly evening meetings, a motley group at Mercy Palms made up of church folks, retired teachers, and even a few ex-cops. They talked about life, faith, and the tangled history of neighborhoods like Englewood. More than once, Marcus left angry or embarrassed, forced to consider that cycles of poverty and prejudice weren't personal failures, but wounds inflicted by neglect and discrimination. Sam pressed Marcus, "Don't let them write your story before you have a chance to live it." Slowly, Marcus let himself learn. Sam showed him how to navigate community college registration at Edgewater City College, filling out FAFSA forms online, its endless fields demanding income statements and proof of residence Marcus barely understood, preparing referrals and writing letters with the dignity of one who knows bureaucracy is just another barrier for outsiders. Marcus studied late into the night, his textbooks surrounded by the scents of LaShonda's Sunday fried chicken and the cinnamon rolls she baked each payday as a treat. On good weeks, Marcus met Sam at Lou's Table, a locals cafe for stacks of buttermilk pancakes and strong coffee. The southern-accented waitress called him sweetheart. A brief moment of gentleness in a hard world. There were setbacks. Marcus's first attempts at math left him bewildered, his reading labored, but he kept going, propelled by Sam's belief and the resolute challenges of his mother. Keisha watched, skeptical but hopeful, and sometimes even helped quiz him on vocabulary words and fractions. On days that soured, Marcus returned to church for solace, singing Amazing Grace with his family, drawing strength from stories of Black Americans who transformed pain into power. Harriet Tubman, Thurgood Marshall, Maya Angelou. He saw himself reflected not in the tragic stories of those lost, but in the hard-won triumphs of those who remained. Even his favorite comfort foods, smoked sausage from Johnson's Market, sweet potato pie on holidays, reminded him of ritual resilience, the blessings passed through generations as lifelines when faith was tested. Spring brought change. Marcus passed his GED exams, scoring high enough to surprise his instructors at Edgewater, who called his mother to congratulate her, the first Carter ever to finish high school. LaShonda cried tears of joy, inviting church friends for a celebration in their apartment, where laughter and gospel music mixed with cornbread, fried catfish, and bottles of grape soda. Marcus promised himself and Keisha that he'd find a better path from here. He started classes at Edgewater in the fall, working nights at Baxter Brothers' distribution warehouse, stacking boxes and hauling freight until dawn. Pay was low, but Marcus wore the badge with pride, proof of his break from the cycle that threatened to claim him. As his world began to expand, Marcus faced new challenges. College introduced him to students who knew nothing of struggle, white boys in expensive sneakers, daughters of doctors and lawyers from Lincoln Park and Evanston, discussing summer trips to Disney World or the Outer Banks. Marcus learned not to envy, but to observe and adapt. He joined study groups and signed up for the African American Student Association, finding allies among other first-generation college hopefuls. At Edgewater, he met Professor Maria Rodriguez, a criminal law instructor with a passion for justice and a willingness to invest her time in those who needed it most. She challenged him to think critically about law, not just as punishment, but as a system of transformation, and to see his own past not as a shame, but as source of unique insight and empathy. Hard work became a habit. Marcus studied while riding the Blue Line, in the break room of Baxter Brothers, under flickering fluorescent lights, in the quiet corners of Mercy Palms, where Sam now worked less and counseled more. Personal victories multiplied. He passed his first college writing course, made the dean's list, and even wrote a poignant essay about forgiveness that Pastor Johnson read aloud at church. LaShonda, energized by his progress, baked apple cobbler for every milestone. Keisha started talking about her own dreams of becoming a doctor, inspired by her brother's perseverance. Yet, trouble lurked. Baxter Brothers downsized in March, leaving Marcus without a paycheck. He spent desperate weeks delivering groceries for Go Quick, a gig app based out of River North, rushing orders to luxury apartments he could barely imagine living in, sometimes passing by high-rise windows lit with the golden glow of wealth and assurance. He kept applying for new jobs: chip factory line cook, janitor at Tech Int Solutions, weekend handler at Hospital for Children's Hope. Each rejection stung, but Marcus pressed on, motivated by Sam's insistence. "You're bigger than this moment." He prayed every night, joining the 55% of Americans who call Christianity their faith, according to Pew's latest numbers. Marcus's world narrowed again when LaShonda fell sick. She'd been coughing for weeks, ignoring pain as she worked nights cleaning rooms at St. Raphael's Hospital. But one morning, she collapsed while frying bacon and eggs, a rare treat meant to cheer Keisha after a tough week in school. Marcus rode with her in a battered ambulance to St. Raphael's, nerves frayed as he watched doctors hustle his mother into intensive care for pneumonia. Bills piled up, but Professor Rodriguez and Mercy Palms raised money to help. The community's answer to crisis, built not on wealth, but on solidarity and faith. Days at the hospital became weeks. Marcus memorized the scent of sanitizer, the mechanical rhythms of beeping monitors, the tired faces of nurses from every walk of American life. Between class, work, and hospital vigils, he felt himself stretched thinner than ever, but he would not let Keisha down, not now. Sometimes he snuck her fast food from Dan's Deli, a burger and fries combo, the taste of defiance and comfort in one greasy paper wrapper. At night, Marcus prayed beside his mother's bed, each prayer a mixture of anger and yearning for deliverance. In those moments, the American dream, the story of perseverance, redemption, and faith, felt like both a cruel mirage and an urgent, necessary goal. When LaShonda finally woke, weak and pale, but smiling with that stubborn Carter steel, Marcus knew they'd survived another battle. Her slow recovery pressed him deeper into work and study, but now he saw every challenge as a test. The calculus quiz that kept him up all night, the seminars in criminal law, the volunteer hours at Mercy Palms advocating for youth rights. Sam cheered his progress, sharing his own memories of struggle, old battles fought in the name of justice, lessons learned from church picnics and courthouse marches. Marcus saw clearly how faith, hard work, and community were woven together in the American story, not just in sermons, but in potluck dinners filled with macaroni salad, baked beans, barbecue chicken, and fiery debate about change. Marcus's transformation was gradual, forged in small moments, a job, a test, an act of kindness, a prayer whispered over an uncertain future. By the time he finished 2 years at Edgewater, applied for transfer to State City University, and earned a merit-based scholarship for his service and essays, the path became clearer, steadier, even in its cliffs and winding turns. As he packed his things, ready for the next leg of his journey, Marcus paused in his living room, surrounded by Keisha's laughter, his mother's fading cough, and the ghosts of all those who had predicted failure, reaching instead now for hope. The journey was far from over, but Marcus knew the story would not be written by anyone but himself. State City University sprawled across 100 acres of manicured lawns and historic brick buildings that seemed to whisper promises of transformation to every student who walked through its iron gates. But for Marcus Anthony Carter, now 23 years old and carrying the weight of his past, like invisible chains wrapped around his chest, the campus felt simultaneously like sanctuary and battlefield, a place where he might finally shed the skin of who Judge Hendricks had declared him to be, or where he might discover that her prophecy had been accurate all along, and that young black men from Englewood didn't belong in places where privilege masqueraded as merit and opportunity disguised itself as equal access, when in reality the playing field had never been level and never would be without fundamental restructuring of systems designed centuries ago to exclude people who looked exactly like him. The pre-law program at State City attracted ambitious students from across Illinois and neighboring states, their faces reflecting the diversity of modern America, even as the underlying power structures remained stubbornly resistant to genuine equity. And Marcus found himself one of only 7 black students in his cohort of 63 aspiring lawyers, a statistic that reminded him daily of how far he still had to climb and how many barriers remained invisible to those who had never encountered them on their own journeys towards success and recognition, in fields historically gatekept by those who benefited most from maintaining existing hierarchies and exclusions. His first semester challenged everything Marcus thought he understood about education and belonging, beginning with constitutional law taught by Professor David Kleinfeld, a brilliant but abrasive scholar who delighted in using the Socratic method to humiliate students who hadn't mastered every nuance of Marbury versus Madison or Brown versus Board of Education, his questions delivered with the precision of surgical strikes designed to expose intellectual weakness and separate those truly committed to legal excellence from those merely occupying space in his classroom. Marcus spent countless nights in the university library, that cathedral of knowledge with its vaulted ceilings and endless stacks of legal volumes bound in leather and smelling of aged paper and accumulated wisdom, preparing for classes with an intensity that left him exhausted but determined, because he understood that failure here would confirm every negative assumption made about him since that day in courtroom 4B, when Judge Hendricks had looked into his eyes and seen only inevitability rather than potential. His studying happened in stolen hours between his part-time job at Riverside Legal Aid Clinic, where he filed paperwork and answered phones for attorneys who defended clients too poor to afford private representation, work that paid barely above minimum wage but provided invaluable exposure to the practical realities of law, as practiced in the trenches rather than in ivory towers where theory reigned supreme and consequences remained abstract concepts rather than lived experiences affecting real families struggling with evictions and custody battles and criminal charges that could destroy entire futures with the stroke of a judge's pen. The isolation Marcus felt at State City ran deeper than simple demographics or socioeconomic difference, extending into the subtle ways his classmates discussed their summer internships at prestigious downtown firms like Morrison and Blackwell, or their family connections to partners at places like Chicago Legal Partners, conversations that happened over expensive coffee at Brewster's Cafe, where lattes cost $6, and students complained about having to use last year's MacBook Pro while Marcus nursed a single cup of black coffee for 3 hours because that $1.50 represented a significant portion of his daily food budget. He watched his peers form study groups that somehow never quite had room for one more member when he inquired about joining, observed how professors seemed to remember the names of students whose parents had attended State City or who came from the right neighborhoods with the right credentials and connections, felt the weight of being simultaneously hyper-visible as one of the few black faces in most spaces, while also being fundamentally invisible as a person with thoughts and dreams and capabilities that extended beyond whatever assumptions people made based on his appearance or the address listed on his financial aid forms that marked him as someone from the wrong side of the tracks, seeking entrance to a world that tolerated diversity in its promotional materials, but remained deeply uncomfortable with actual inclusion that might threaten existing power arrangements. Professor Maria Rodriguez became Marcus's lifeline during those first difficult months at State City. Her office a refuge where he could speak honestly about struggling to keep up with reading assignments while working 25 hours weekly at Riverside, about feeling like an imposter among students who discussed law school rankings and judicial clerkships as if these opportunities were birthright rather than distant possibilities requiring navigation of invisible networks and unspoken rules that no one bothered explaining to those who hadn't grown up understanding how elite institutions actually functioned beneath their meritocratic facades. Rodriguez, herself the daughter of immigrants who had cleaned office buildings while putting themselves through community college, recognized in Marcus the particular hunger of those who understood that education represented not just personal advancement, but generational transformation, a chance to rewrite family narratives and open doors that had remained locked for parents and grandparents who worked themselves to exhaustion in jobs that paid just enough to survive, but never enough to thrive, or build the kind of security that allowed their children to take risks or pursue dreams that extended beyond immediate necessity. She pushed Marcus to consider law school, specifically suggesting he prepare for the LSAT that coming summer, arguing that his perspective and experiences would make him an exceptional attorney capable of understanding clients and systems in ways that students from privileged backgrounds could never fully grasp, no matter how much theoretical knowledge they accumulated or how many Supreme Court decisions they memorized for examinations that tested recall rather than wisdom or genuine commitment to justice as something more than abstract principle. The suggestion terrified Marcus because law school represented an investment of time and money and emotional energy that seemed almost impossibly beyond reach for someone still sending money home to help his mother cover rent and utilities at their Englewood apartment, where LaShonda continued working night shifts at St. Raphael's Hospital, despite her lingering health issues, because the Carter family had never had the luxury of stopping to rest or recover when bills demanded payment, and Keisha needed money for school supplies and college application fees as she prepared to follow her brother's path toward higher education, and hopefully a future less constrained by the poverty and limited options that had defined previous generations. Marcus lay awake nights in his cramped studio apartment near campus, the sounds of college students partying filtering through thin walls, while he calculated whether he could possibly afford LSAT preparation courses that cost hundreds of dollars, or whether he would have to rely on library books and free online resources, while his better-funded peers enrolled in intensive programs led by instructors who promised score improvements and insider strategies for conquering the test that served as gatekeeper to legal education and, by extension, to the profession itself, with all its power and prestige and potential for either reinforcing existing injustices or working toward their dismantling, depending on whose interests attorneys chose to serve once admitted to the bar. If you're inspired by Marcus's journey from judgment to justice, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss these powerful stories of transformation. Drop a comment below saying, "Faith moves mountains," to show your support for this incredible testament to redemption and perseverance. Your engagement helps us share more stories that matter and inspire change in our communities and beyond. Spring semester brought new challenges as Marcus enrolled in criminal procedure, a course taught by Professor Thomas Bradford, a former prosecutor who viewed the criminal justice system through the lens of someone who had spent 20 years sending people to prison, and seemed genuinely perplexed when students like Marcus questioned whether the system might be fundamentally broken rather than merely in need of minor adjustments around the edges. The tension between them erupted during a discussion of Terry stops and reasonable suspicion when Marcus shared his own experience of being stopped by police 17 times between ages 15 and 21, despite never being charged with anything beyond that single possession case that had brought him before Judge Hendricks. His personal testimony, offered not as complaint but as data point illustrating how constitutional protections theoretically guaranteed to all citizens functioned very differently depending on neighborhood and skin color and assumptions police officers made about who belonged where and who deserved suspicion versus who merited the benefit of doubt that Marcus had never once received during any of those encounters with law enforcement. Professor Bradford dismissed Marcus's experiences as anecdotal rather than systematic, suggesting that perhaps Marcus should consider why he kept finding himself in situations that attracted police attention rather than assuming bias on the part of officers simply doing their jobs in difficult circumstances. And the classroom fell silent as other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain whether to support Marcus's position or defer to their professor's authority and expertise. As former insider to the system under critique, Marcus left class that day feeling the old rage bubbling up from places he thought he had learned to control through prayer and meditation and the breathing exercises Mr. Samuel Washington had taught him during their sessions at Mercy Palms Community Center, but the anger felt righteous rather than destructive, because it stemmed not from wounded pride, but from recognition that systems of oppression depended on people like Professor Bradford, who could witness injustice and explain it away as reasonable policy or unfortunate necessity, rather than acknowledging the deliberate choices embedded in everything, from arrest patterns to sentencing guidelines to the architecture of courtrooms themselves, designed to intimidate and overwhelm rather than welcome or facilitate genuine understanding between parties supposedly equal before the law, but actually separated by vast chasms of power and resources and access to competent representation. He called his mother that evening from his apartment while eating ramen noodles for the third consecutive dinner, because payday was still 4 days away and his budget allowed for little beyond basic survival. LaShonda's voice on the other end of the connection, offering the same wisdom she had provided throughout his journey toward this moment when staying in school and pursuing dreams felt harder than surrendering to Judge Hendrix's prophecy and accepting that some barriers existed not to be overcome, but to mark permanent boundaries beyond which certain people were never meant to venture, regardless of their efforts or capabilities or moral worth. The LSAT loomed over Marcus's summer-like storm clouds, promising either deliverance or destruction, depending on his performance on a single test that would determine whether law schools took his applications seriously or dismissed them as aspirational fantasies from someone whose undergraduate grades and lack of connections and absence of prestigious internships already marked him as long shot at best. He studied with focused intensity that worried even Professor Rodriguez, who found him in the library at 2 in the morning working through logic games and reading comprehension passages, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking slightly from too much coffee and too little sleep as he pushed himself toward mastery of material that seemed designed to favor those who had grown up playing with puzzles and games and developing the kind of abstract reasoning skills that correlated strongly with socioeconomic privilege and access to educational enrichment from early childhood through high school in ways that made standardized tests anything but standard measures of ability or potential. Marcus supplemented his studying with whatever free resources he could find online and borrowed preparation books from the State City Library, their pages already worn from previous students who had walked this path before him with varying degrees of success, and he formed a small study group with 2 other pre-law students from working-class backgrounds who understood that they were competing not just against the test itself, but against systemic advantages their wealthier peers took for granted as natural order, rather than inherited privilege compounded across generations. Test day arrived in September with unseasonably cool temperatures that felt like harbinger of change. As Marcus rode the Red Line downtown to the testing center located in a commercial building on Wacker Drive, surrounded by other aspiring lawyers whose nervous energy filled the waiting room with palpable tension as they checked and rechecked their admission tickets and identification documents while avoiding eye contact that might somehow transmit anxiety or undermine whatever confidence they had managed to construct during months of preparation. Marcus sat for 4 hours answering questions that would partially determine his future, forcing himself to breathe slowly and recall everything Professor Rodriguez had taught him about approaching standardized tests as puzzles to be solved, rather than judgments on his worth or intelligence or likelihood of success in legal profession that desperately needed people who understood injustice from experience rather than theory. Walking out of the testing center into afternoon sunlight that seemed almost too bright after hours under fluorescent lights, Marcus felt both relief and terror, because now his fate rested in the hands of algorithms and admissions committees who would reduce his entire life story to numbers and brief essays, attempting to capture in 500 words what it meant to come from Englewood and survive Judge Hendrix's prophecy, and still believe that law could be a tool for liberation rather than Just another mechanism of control and oppression dressed in robes of respectability and neutral language that disguised whose interests the system actually served. The 3-month wait for LSAT scores felt interminable as Marcus threw himself into his final year at State City, taking advanced courses in constitutional law and criminal justice reform while working increased hours at Riverside Legal Aid, where he had been promoted to paralegal position that paid slightly better and offered more responsibility, including client interviews and legal research that gave him practical skills, complementing his theoretical education. He watched attorneys at Riverside fight losing battles against systems designed to process poor people through courts with assembly line efficiency, observed how even dedicated public defenders struggled under caseloads that made genuine advocacy nearly impossible, and understood with growing clarity that becoming lawyer meant choosing daily whether to serve justice or merely facilitate the smooth functioning of machinery that ground up lives and families, while claiming to pursue order and safety for communities that receive neither from policies that prioritize punishment over prevention or genuine addressing of root causes driving people toward criminal activity in first place. Marcus thought often of Judge Hendricks during those months, wondering whether she ever reflected on the young people who passed through her courtroom and what became of them after she pronounced judgment and moved on to the next case, whether she recognized her own role in either facilitating transformation or confirming condemnation through words that carried weight far beyond their immediate legal meaning, because they told young people who they were allowed to become and what futures remained available or foreclosed, based on decisions made by authority figures who wielded power without necessarily understanding or caring about its full impact on lives they would never have to witness beyond brief courtroom encounters. When Marcus Anthony Carter received his LSAT scores in early December, the numbers glowing on his laptop screen in his cramped studio apartment seemed almost impossible to believe. A 168 out of 180, placing him in the 97th percentile nationally and well above the median for top law schools across the country, including Northwestern and University of Chicago, and even institutions like Columbia and NYU that had seemed like distant fantasies when he first began contemplating legal education as pathway toward redemption and purpose beyond mere survival in systems designed to exclude rather than embrace people from neighborhoods like Englewood, where success stories remained rare enough to feel almost mythical in their improbability. He called his mother immediately despite the late hour, LaShonda's scream of joy so loud that Marcus had to pull the phone away from his ear while tears streamed down his face, because this number represented more than personal achievement. It symbolized the shattering of Judge Hendricks's prophecy and proof that her certainty about his inevitable failure had been wrong in the most fundamental way possible, that young black men from the South Side could exceed expectations and defy stereotypes, and claim spaces in institutions that had historically excluded them through both explicit policy and subtle mechanisms of gatekeeping that functioned just as effectively as any law ever written to maintain boundaries between those deemed worthy of opportunity and those considered inherently deficient or dangerous or disposable. The law school application process consumed Marcus's winter break as he crafted personal statements attempting to capture his journey from that courtroom at 17 to this moment at 24, when he dared imagine himself not just surviving, but thriving, not just escaping poverty, but returning with tools and credentials and knowledge that might help others navigate systems that seemed designed to ensnare rather than serve the communities most desperately needing genuine justice, rather than mere processing through courts and prisons that had become America's primary response to poverty and trauma and the accumulated wounds of centuries of deliberate exclusion from wealth and opportunity. Professor Rodriguez reviewed his essays with meticulous attention, helping him frame his experiences not as sob story seeking pity, but as evidence of perspective and resilience that would make him exceptional attorney, capable of understanding clients that many lawyers couldn't or wouldn't see as fully human, with complex stories deserving careful consideration rather than rushed judgment based on superficial assessment of circumstances divorced from historical context or systemic analysis. Marcus applied to 15 law schools, ranging from regional institutions where his scores virtually guaranteed admission and significant scholarship money to elite programs where his numbers placed him in competitive range, but where his background and lack of traditional credentials might work against him in admissions processes that claim to value diversity while often favoring applicants whose diversity came packaged with prep school education and family connections that smoothed rough edges and provided safety nets Marcus had never possessed. Spring brought acceptance letters that arrived with surprising frequency, each envelope containing not just admission, but scholarship offers that transformed law school from impossible dream into realistic possibility, even for someone whose entire family's net worth amounted to less than single semester's tuition at institutions where some students drove cars worth more than Marcus had earned in his entire working life. He was accepted to Northwestern with half tuition covered, University of Illinois with full tuition plus stipend, and shockingly to Columbia Law School in New York City with a named scholarship for students from underrepresented backgrounds who demonstrated both academic excellence and commitment to public interest law, the kind of opportunity that would have seemed absurd to imagine during those dark days after his arrest when future looked like nothing but variations on Judge Hendrix's grim prediction. Marcus agonized over the decision with Professor Rodriguez and Mr. Washington, who had remained constant presence throughout his undergraduate years, despite advancing age and declining health, that worried Marcus because Sam had become the father figure he had never had, offering wisdom and encouragement and practical advice about navigating institutions that weren't built with people like them in mind, but which could be infiltrated and potentially transformed if enough committed individuals gained entry and refused to abandon their values or forget their communities once inside. Ultimately, Marcus chose University of Illinois College of Law, partly because the full scholarship and living stipend meant he could continue sending money home to support his mother and help Keisha, who had been accepted to State City University, with plans to study pre-med, but also because staying in Illinois meant remaining connected to the communities and systems he hoped to impact, rather than pursuing prestige in New York, where distance might erode his sense of purpose, or where the seductions of corporate law with its massive salaries might prove too tempting when student loan debt wasn't driving decisions, and where forgetting origins became easier when surrounded by people whose struggles bore no resemblance to those Marcus had experienced and witnessed throughout his life. Law school proved even more demanding than undergraduate education, the workload crushing and the competition fierce among students who had excelled at prestigious universities and who approached legal education with single-minded intensity that sometimes felt inhuman in its disregard for anything beyond class rank and journal positions, and the recruiting process that dominated second year when big law firms descended on campus offering summer associate positions, paying nearly $4,000 weekly, amounts that seemed obscene to Marcus, who had never earned more than $15 hourly in his life, and who watched classmates agonize over whether to accept offers from firms ranked 7th versus 9th in prestige, as if these distinctions mattered more than the actual work they might do or clients they might serve. Marcus found his tribe among a small group of public interest-minded students who volunteered at Central Illinois Legal Aid and participated in criminal defense clinic, where they represented actual clients under supervision of clinical professors. their work providing genuine service to people who needed lawyers but couldn't afford the hourly rates that made legal assistance luxury good rather than fundamental right, supposedly guaranteed by constitutional principles that looked beautiful on paper, but functioned very differently in practice when public defender offices operated with fractions of resources available to prosecutors' offices and where plea bargains resolved 97% of cases because system couldn't function if everyone actually demanded their right to trial. During his second year, Marcus worked on a case involving a young man named Deshaun Williams, who faced charges nearly identical to those Marcus himself had confronted 7 years earlier. The parallels so striking that Marcus sometimes felt like he was defending his younger self and attempting to rewrite history by providing the kind of vigorous advocacy he had never received from his overworked public defender, who had processed his case with mechanical efficiency but without genuine investigation, or challenged a police account that went unquestioned, despite inconsistencies that might have created reasonable doubt if anyone had bothered looking carefully at evidence rather than accepting assumptions about young black men in certain neighborhoods at certain times engaged in activities that looked suspicious to officers whose training and experience taught them to see threats rather than citizens deserving protection and presumption of innocence that supposedly anchored American criminal justice system. The Deshaun Williams case consumed Marcus for months as he investigated witnesses and filed motions and prepared for trial under supervision of Professor Catherine Chen, who ran the criminal defense clinic with passionate commitment to ensuring that her students understood law not as abstract intellectual exercise, but as tool that could either liberate or destroy, depending on whose hands wielded it and toward what ends. Marcus interviewed Deshaun's family at their small apartment on the west side, where Deshaun's grandmother served sweet tea and cornbread, while explaining through tears how her grandson was a good boy who made mistakes but didn't deserve to have his entire future determined by a single moment of poor judgment. Her words echoing things Marcus's own mother had said about him and reminding him that behind every case file and docket number existed real people with families who loved them and communities that needed them and potential that could be nurtured or crushed, depending on whether system chose rehabilitation or mere punishment as response to human fallibility, and the circumstances that drove people toward choices they might not make if better options existed or seemed genuinely available, rather than theoretical possibilities that required navigating obstacles most Americans never encountered or couldn't imagine, because their lives unfolded in spaces where mistakes brought consequences, but not catastrophe, and where recovery remained possible because resources and second chances flowed more freely to those whose skin color and zip codes and family connections provided cushions against the full weight of judgment. The trial took place in the same Cook County courthouse where Marcus had stood before Judge Hendricks, though in different courtroom with different judge. And Marcus felt a strange mixture of emotions as he walked through those familiar corridors, now wearing suit and carrying briefcase and preparing to argue on behalf of someone else, rather than standing silently while others decided his fate. The prosecution offered plea bargain that would have meant 3 years in prison, but Deshaun refused against advice of his family, who feared trial might result in harsher sentence if jury convicted. And Marcus supported his client's decision because he understood from personal experience that sometimes principle mattered more than pragmatism, and that accepting guilt for crimes you didn't commit might seem like smart strategy, but carried costs that extended beyond immediate legal consequences into realm of self-respect and dignity, and the ability to maintain hope that justice existed somewhere, even if you couldn't always access it through official channels. Marcus prepared witnesses and cross-examined police officers whose testimony contained contradictions they couldn't adequately explain, and he delivered closing argument that drew on both legal doctrine and personal understanding of how assumptions and biases infected supposedly objective police work and prosecutorial discretion. His words carrying power not just from legal training, but from authenticity that came from speaking about realities he had lived rather than merely studied in textbooks or discussed in seminars. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning verdict of not guilty, and Marcus watched Deshawn collapse in tears while his grandmother praised God and thanked Jesus in the particular cadence of Black Baptist tradition that Marcus recognized from his own church, where faith wasn't abstract theology, but concrete lifelines sustaining people through trials that would have broken those without belief in something larger than themselves or current circumstances. Professor Chen congratulated Marcus on exceptional work and suggested he consider career as public defender or criminal defense attorney, noting that his combination of legal skill and personal insight made him uniquely qualified to serve clients most attorneys either couldn't understand or didn't particularly care about beyond professional obligation to provide minimally competent representation. That evening, Marcus celebrated with small group of friends over deep dish pizza at Giovanni's Italian kitchen and cheap beer. The taste of victory sweeter than any meal he could remember because it represented not just personal achievement, but genuine impact on another person's life and small strike against system that too often ground up people like Deshawn and himself without bothering to distinguish between those who deserved punishment and those who deserved mercy, or at least genuine investigation before judgment was rendered. Marcus's third year of law school focused primarily on bar preparation and job search, the latter complicated by his commitment to public interest work that paid fraction of what corporate positions offered, but which aligned with his sense of purpose and obligation to communities that had shaped him and needed advocates who understood their struggles from inside, rather than viewing poverty and crime as abstract problems requiring technical legal solutions divorced from political and economic contexts that created conditions driving people toward desperate choices or illegal activities. He accepted position with Chicago Justice Coalition, non-profit organization focused on criminal justice reform and providing legal services to people re-entering society after incarceration. Their work addressing not just immediate legal needs, but systemic issues like employment discrimination and housing barriers, and the 1,000 obstacles preventing genuine rehabilitation and reintegration in society that claim to value second chances, but actually punished past mistakes indefinitely through both formal policies and informal discrimination that kept people trapped in cycles of poverty and recidivism that then got cited as evidence of inherent criminality rather than predictable outcome of deliberate exclusion. The bar exam approached with its own terrors, months of studying reduced to 2 days of testing that would determine whether years of education translated into license to practice law or merely expensive credential without professional authorization to use it in service of clients and causes Marcus cared about. He studied alongside other soon-to-be graduates at coffee shops and libraries across Chicago, reviewing civil procedure and constitutional law and contracts while eating sandwiches from Jimmy's Deli and drinking endless cups of coffee that fueled marathon sessions, where exhaustion fought with determination, and where Marcus sometimes wondered whether he had truly escaped Judge Hendrix's prophecy or merely postponed its fulfillment because part of him still carried that 17-year-old boy's fear that he wasn't good enough or smart enough or destined for anything beyond the failure she had predicted with such absolute certainty. The bar exam itself passed in blur of essay questions and multiple choice sections testing everything from torts to trusts, and afterward, Marcus felt hollowed out but cautiously optimistic that he had performed adequately, even if not brilliantly, his fate now resting with bar examiners who would spend months reviewing his answers and background check before deciding whether Marcus Anthony Carter, formerly convicted juvenile offender from Englewood, could be trusted with responsibility of representing clients and upholding justice in system that had once tried to destroy him. The wait for bar results stretched across summer as Marcus began his position at Chicago Justice Coalition, working with people recently released from prison who needed help expunging records or finding employment or navigating maze of probation requirements and re-entry programs that theoretically existed to support rehabilitation, but often functioned more like extended punishment designed to ensure failure through impossible conditions and insufficient support. Marcus met men and women whose stories mirrored his own in essential ways, people who had made mistakes but possessed dignity and potential that society refused to recognize, and he understood with growing conviction that his purpose wasn't just individual success, but contribution to larger movement, transforming systems that had caused so much unnecessary suffering while claiming to pursue safety and order. When results finally posted online in late October, Marcus was sitting in Mercy Palms Community Center with Mr. Washington, who had insisted on being present for this moment, and when Marcus saw his name on the list of those who passed, the old man embraced him with tears streaming down his weathered face while whispering, "You did it, son. You really did it." And Marcus felt decade of struggle and doubt and determination finally crystallize into a single moment of validation that wasn't about proving Judge Hendricks wrong, but about proving himself right. Right to believe in possibility, right to pursue redemption, right to claim space in profession, dedicated theoretically to justice, even when reality fell short of ideal. His swearing-in ceremony took place in December at the same Cook County courthouse where his journey had begun. LaShonda and Keisha, and surviving members of Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church filling several rows as Marcus stood with other new attorneys and raised his right hand to swear oath supporting Constitution and promising to serve justice faithfully and competently. As Marcus scanned the courtroom during ceremony, his eyes stopped suddenly on familiar face in the back row. Judge Patricia Hendricks, retired now according to information Marcus had found online, but still apparently maintaining connections to courthouse where she had spent her career. Their eyes met across the space, and Marcus saw something flash in her expression that might have been recognition or surprise, or perhaps the first stirring of understanding that her prophecy had been wrong, that the boy she had dismissed had become man she would soon encounter not as defendant, but as equal professional in pursuit of justice. They both claimed to serve, though from very different positions and perspectives, shaped by vastly different lived experiences and relationships to power and privilege, and the systems governing who received mercy and who received only judgment and condemnation without possibility of redemption, regardless of effort or transformation. Marcus held her gaze for a long moment before turning his attention back to ceremony, knowing that their story wasn't finished yet, that fate had brought them both to this moment for reasons that would soon become clear in ways neither of them could have anticipated or imagined.